I feel like for a lot of our like listeners who have been following the show along, we should definitely do a name that tune, which would go from the notes in our whatsyourbaseline.com plus listening to the episode and be like, hey, do you recognize I don't know, basement apartment, or do you
Oh,
recognize rake beat
oh,
chords?
yeah. Yeah, Jeremy's songs. I thought
Exactly.
you meant popular tunes, from the 50s and 60s. Like
Don't get us
I got
sued, man. We
I
can't
got
afford
I
a
got you,
copyright
babe.
strike. Don't say them too much. Oh, Roland, you are tempting fate with the copyright gods.
In all
Oh,
seriousness, dear listeners, you do not want to listen to us singing here because one of the two can't really sing. And I leave it like that. Welcome to the What's Your Baseline podcast, where we demystify enterprise architecture and business process management.
we're here to bring best practices and lessons learned from our years to your ears, as well as interviewing friends we met along the way on our professional journeys.
My name is Roland Volt, and I'm joined today by my co-host, JM Erlandson. Hey, JM, how are you doing today?
Roland, I'm doing great. I've been training up a little bit to do very long walks. I have a planned very long walk coming up. And today I spent 15 kilometers tootling around a part of Toronto that I really love. And it's a good long walk, 3.5 hours. That's what you should do on a Sunday morning. And then I had to drag my butt back here to do a podcast. So I'm feeling good, but I'm also feeling charged up, man. How are you feeling?
Well, it will be that I will have to carry the show then, I guess, because you will
Oh,
just
okay.
snooze away, physical activity and all that stuff. I'm doing okay. I got something new. For those of you who are watching us might notice it. I have a new camera, and it's
Ooh.
one of those little thingies that has a little arm that hangs, where the camera hangs in front of
Mm-hmm.
the screen. So that you get more eye contact. So I want to be very, very, intense now when I talk with you.
Yeah,
Yeah,
Roland
exactly.
looking straight in the screen, right down the barrel at all of our audience members. I get
Creepy,
that. Listen, we
creepy
want to
dude.
connect with you on a few different things, folks. I mean, the idea is, but this is not just us, spewing our best practices at each other and agreeing most of the time, but also disagreeing a little bit. But instead, it's meant to be sort of a community event where people can come in, feel like they're connected to the topic, but also feel like they're welcome to give feedback or to respond. I think, Roland, our last couple of posts on LinkedIn have had some really good audience feedback with some ideas on what things we could cover in the future, or some concerns and criticism about the content, which we got into a really cool little debate back and forth. I mean, that's what we want. This is an emerging field. And I say emerging in the sense that it's been around for decades and decades, and yet still it keeps evolving, and new ideas, new thought drives it towards a new state. And I love that. And the fact we're a little part of it makes me really happy.
Yeah, but none of those recommendations was that we all meet in person and then just stare at each other.
only Mirko recommends that. Is that right?
Yeah, maybe. I don't know. You ask him. You ask him. But hey, speaking, and again, another episode where I don't know how I get the bridge to the actual topic. So maybe I don't try it. Maybe we need to improve our process. And for that, we do have a very interesting topic today. I hope it's interesting. We're going to talk about process analysis, which sounds a little bit boring, but I was just thinking the other day, what would happen if I was a new business analyst, just maybe fresh from college, or just hopping on that role, and you get tasked with, make things better. So where would you start, right? And I thought that was a good idea. And I remember back in the day, I wrote some articles about it. And I also, for my day job, I created a nice article about what is process intelligence. And my thought was, why don't we just marry those two things and make a What's Your Baseline episode out of it?
Yeah, I mean, we've both been in that position before, where we're sitting in front of a blank page and someone says, make this better. And that's a really scary place to be. You want to be able to understand what this is. You want to know some techniques you might have to be able to uncover some of the challenges with this. And you want to have a way to, like a lever, to propose a real solution that might make a difference to how this performs. So I remember when I was just getting my career started out, I joined a management consulting company. I was in manufacturing before then. My first sort of real like moving into the theory of process analysis more than just like working on the line, like improving individual mechanical operations, was in consulting. And I was very fortunate at the time to have a manager as a junior QA analyst for process who really had a structured and regimented approach to how we tackled problem solving. But I was fortunate to have that. And I know so many stepping into that role, particularly fresh from college, don't have it. So let's start with defining our problem. So what are the kinds of things we're going to look for? Let's talk about how we take a structured approach to being able to investigate that problem and how we turn those investigations into some sort of solution. So Roland, obviously our very first question here is, how do I define and how do I uncover a problem?
Yeah, well, I think the big problem that you have is you might not be able to define your problem, right? And the way how I see it, it's basically three things that we need to put in order. I don't know if that's the right word, but the biggest challenge that you have is when you're that new BA is, well, what the heck is going on? Or to say it in more professional terms, how do I get the visibility into these things? Because I might not know what to look for, right? It's when you say in your past life, manufacturing processes, that's very obvious. You see a conveyor belt and things get produced, and at the end of the line, a widget pops off, and if it's a car, it gets driven out, and if it's a lawnmower, it goes into a box and a forklift picks it up. Whatever it is, you can see it. But in the majority of the cases, well, what do we all do? Right? We're all doing knowledge work, right? White collar stuff, right? And now you tell me, how many pounds of loan applications have you underwritten in the last week?
Oh boy. Yeah, that's tough. But we want to understand it more deeply, right? So you mentioned visibility as the first piece of the puzzle, right? There's three pieces of the puzzle that we're going to talk about. We talk about defining our problem, but let's first uncover each one of them before we get into anything further. Sure. Visibility, from my perspective, comes from being able to see what is a representation of individual activity, system activity, human activity, and uncovering that is often a very cumbersome, sometimes quite expensive problem to help to solve. The idea is, historically, that's been something you'd look at from a time and motion study or through interview processes, through very manual, physical, actual showing up where the process is being executed and trying to abstract what you're seeing physically into something you can write down and represent digitally. Yeah. In my perspective, that approach is often flawed because that sort of visibility has a ton of observational bias, something we deal with a ton in this interview scenario, right?
We're getting to that. We're getting to that a little bit later, JM. You should read the notes that we write for the outline of this show. But yeah, you're right. There's some bias and all that type of stuff. But I think the biggest challenge is, when it comes to visibility, is what you don't measure, you can't improve. Right. So the first question is, well, what should I measure? And then the second step is, I think, how do I analyze this? Now that I've observed something or I've seen something, well, what do I do with it? Right. So that's the second part, which I think is the largest part of our conversation. And then the third thing is, well, how do I make this thing live? How do I change execution? Right. So when you think about it, it's great that you see where the skeletons are buried. It's great that you've identified that's a skeleton and that you have an issue. So what? Right? If you don't act on it, well, guess what? Then all that effort was useless. So I think the problem is visibility, and then figuring out what to do from an analysis perspective, and then bring it into the real life in your execution, your process execution. And then obviously close the loop again, right?
Yeah,
Because as a German national football coach once said, after the game is before the game.
that's true. But so let's dig into visibility then, because I previewed it a little bit, but getting a handle on the process can be a very time consuming and cumbersome exercise. But that's where bringing things like digital tools into play are really important. We'll talk about the approaches later, but essentially what we're trying to do is uncover the sequence of activities that happen and the order they happened, when they happened, to be able to draw out some representation of this process in a transportable language. So as a business analyst, one of the first things we want to try and do is facilitate the communication that will later on be sort of that central space for analysis and discussion. So capturing that information, and I don't trust the existing documentation 90% of the time. I want to verify the information that's being sent to me so that I can make sure that what I'm presenting to my stakeholders that we're talking about in a few seconds is as accurate as possible, as comprehensive as necessary, and something that is facilitating conversation rather than a certainty that closes the door for change.
Mm-hmm. So let me ask you a question, and let me play devil's advocate here.
Sure.
When do you do this?
That's a good question. I mean, the key here is whether or not a project already has a specific defined scope. Because if someone else has done the work to define your scope and give you a set of processes and sort of lay out the value of this kind of initiative, then you can respond to task. So, hey, I've given you a set, going out one at a time, picking these up as part of your job. But as you said, after the game is before the game, before the game is after the game. Oftentimes, you're trying to uncover key areas for improvement before you actually define the scope of a project. And ideally, that pre-analysis makes it so that when you get to the main analytical phase, you're not wasting your time on things that have no value to the organization. So Roland, I know we talk a lot. I talk those two big words, value and waste. I think you might define this as an earlier phase and tell me how you would make the decision to even make the choice on a process.
I think you can use that both things, and I will define them in a minute. You can use them in two scenarios, and you mentioned them already. One is you have a project, and the project says, "Oh, we shall automate this process," or whatever it is, right? We shall solve this problem. The other thing is what you also said is, well, as a business analyst or a business architect, you build structures. So you should be the person who has the overview of, hey, what's going on? And you should be able to identify, oh, this is an area we should focus our attention on. And not so much this, so that's something that's outside of a project. And many moons ago, we had an episode about the process lifecycle or the solution lifecycle. And if you remember those 5 steps that we had, there was one which was the high-level design and program roadmap phase. And I think that is one. And then the first example would go into solution design. But you mentioned 2 aspects. You said waste and you said value. The question is, well, what is what, right? And if I can aim a little definition on this, I would define value as the measurable outcome of a process, right?
Yeah.
So that could be, in your manufacturing example, more widgets, because more widgets means more stuff to sell, means more money in the coffers, right? Waste, on the other side, is actually all those little things, and I'm pretty sure Sebastian Kutula will be very nervous now when I try to define this. Waste are basically all activities that you do, but that do not contribute to the value creation. Right? Yeah. For example, you have things laying around instead of being on the conveyor belt and going directly to the next step, right? Or you have too much inventory in your warehouse, or you have too many resources. doing things.
Or rework steps or unnecessary governance and
Yes.
approval steps that don't have real like validation requirements based on regulatory obligations. There's a lot of waste things, but we're trying to identify these. And, approaches like Lean Six Sigma really hone in on this kind of thing, but at a very low level.
We will
at a
get
high
to
level,
this.
we're trying to abstract that, right?
Yeah, don't spill the beans now. We will get to this a little bit later in the second part of the show. But both things, value and waste, are basically the two things that I think you should have a look at when you think about the life cycle. And I will put that graphic back in the show notes. When you look at the program roadmap and high-level design, as well as the solution design of one transition state, And if you have nothing, so if you have nothing to do as the BA, right, because you don't have a project that says now go robot, well, that should be your thought about, how do I figure out how I can make my organization a better organization, right, to create a better outcome.
And that's the idea. People want to do that, right? Like people don't become business analysts. At least I believe that people don't become business analysts because they want to burn hours and not achieve tangible outcomes. You want to become a business analyst because you want to apply your acumen, your problem solving skills to help improve somebody's circumstances. I have to believe that in my heart. Otherwise, why would I do what I do? And if you do that, you want to look at certain areas. So the next topic, Roland, I want to dig through here is if I'm starting to do that visibility, what am I looking for? Right? What are the kinds of things that pop out and the analysis areas that I might dig into to start to get a sense of the scope of my problem, the scope of the effort that I'm going to have to undergo. And in my case, oftentimes the stakeholders I'm going to have to involve in my information gathering and perhaps more importantly, my problem solving. So when I look at that, I see a few different areas. Obviously, because I'm a process guy, the center of my house is often process. So I want to understand the high level processes and value chains that exist. Then I want to be able to uncover underneath them the individual tasks that form each of those processes at a sub-process level where I can afford to, and go into not necessarily like the very individual click level tasks or very, very manual, like technical tasks, but enough that I can define the logical flow. Then I want to talk about how those things are enabled. Think of it as a capability or more practically as like applications that are required in order for the current process as it is to be executed, as well as the people who carry out each of these tasks. That's often a negotiation, I understand, but I've got my processes, I've got my actors in the terms of applications and organization. Then I want to try and categorize that with information. So what kind of data comes into a step, so is required in order for that step to go forward? Good example, you're filling out a purchase requisition. You need to have the purchasing item code, what you want to buy. That's data that has to come in. You need to have the vendor. That's data that has to come in. And then data that is produced. So in terms of completed forms or certain types of information that you're producing, let's say you have a customer interaction step and you're producing a set of customer data that is now generally available for future steps in your process. And lastly, I also want to be cognizant of the environment around it, particularly when I'm working in regulated environments. Risks and controls that are happening often are my sort of second tier of analysis. But when I look into the information that I need to collect to have a good picture of what I should be concerned about when I'm improving this, risk and control does come up, and they're very tenacious stakeholders. So you want to make sure you catch them early, you involve them in the capture and understanding process. So you're not letting them know at the end of line, hey guys, we're going to change some stuff. And they go, whoa, no, wait a second. You never talked to us. So it's often good to involve those as you discover and get the visibility into how your system works today.
I agree. And by the way, but maybe you should change the title of this episode. It's not just process analysis. What you were talking about is enterprise architecture, and not in the sense how some tool vendors want to see it in the sense of IT architecture. I think that is the beauty, and that's what motivates me to work in this field. Is you can take a step back and you can have a look at the whole situation, right? You're not shoehorned into a certain thing like, hey, JM, you're going to do process, and then go back into your lane. You have nothing to do. App rationalization is my thing. You know what I mean? Yeah. So I think that is the beauty of this.
Yeah.
I think, and I just want to stress it, right? It is having that holistic view. Say, okay, you look at processes, you look at technology, you look at organization, you look at data, and you look at risks.
Yeah.
Right. And getting those 5 into a balance is A, challenging, B, interesting. And then think about that you have to do this on 2 different levels. One is when you do that high level design, you need to understand, say, your risk framework, what was identified and what is the big thing for my organization. And then with that lens, look at your processes and say, oh, I think in that corner, down there in the lower left-hand corner, there's something that could start smelling,
Yeah.
While you do the same thing with whatever, your org classes, right? Or your app classes to say, oh yeah, does it make sense to replace that SAP system with a single spreadsheet because one license of Microsoft Excel is so much cheaper than an SAP license? Whatever, I make that up, right? So maybe in closing of this first half of our show, right? And time flies, as we can see. Dear listeners, let me ask you a question. How do you do this in your organization? Are you more driven by project that somebody else defines? Or do you have the freedom and the liberty to decide where you want to work on? And basically taking that step back and have a look at the whole landscape of your organization. And if you do that, either way, do you agree with what we discussed, that you need to have visibility first, and then you do analysis, and then go into execution? Or do you say, no, my job is doing analysis, and I do as I'm told? We'll leave you with those questions for a couple of seconds, and we'll see you right after this.
I don't go to the big screen movies. I got my phone instead. I'm finding it hard to get it going, but I know I must be going soon. I gotta get out of here. I gotta get out of here. I'm climbing up the walls. I gotta get out of here.
And welcome back to the second section. I know we spent the first section defining a lot of the problem. And now, Roland, you and I have to define the solution for this. Because the question is, how do we actually do meaningful process analysis that leads to proposals of significant, or at least value-driven or waste reduction-driven change to processes? And when we look in the market, we look at techniques, tools and techniques. I see sort of this tiers of ways of approaching this. We start with simple like manual approaches, methodologies, ways of working that have really stood the test of time. That's moved into digital tools that have helped to facilitate that. That sort of, some are more aligned with methodology, some are methodology agnostic, and then moved into new automation, advanced features, even AI, that help us to enhance digital tools with new technology approaches. Let's start with the very manual. Let's actually start with the methodologies, and talk to me a little bit about, if you have nothing, before you even start with a digital tool, what's your methodological approach to tackling process analysis, and what would you recommend to a brand new analyst?
That is a hard question. So I could point to the episode that we had with Brienne, how to set up a business architecture and identify the value streams and do a ton of interviews and these type of things, I think if you don't have a tool, you have a hard time, right? So I think what you need is you need to have some form of repository. And we had an episode about how to choose your architecture tool and all that stuff literally in season 1 because it's so important, But to bring in a downer to this conversation, well, have a look at those tools. Right? It's great that you have a repository, and as you know, we're an equal opportunity tool podcast, right? So we don't have, well, we might have some preferences, but we don't want to prescribe it. But when you look at the different tools, I found it really sobering, because when you look at it, those tools came out like 30 something years ago. And what do you get? You get a modeling environment where you can capture all that information. What we just spoke about, processes and steps and roles and apps and all that type of stuff. That's all great. But now what? Right? And what I see is that the tool either do not offer anything, which is obviously super sad, or they offer statistical reporting, right? But when I look at those reports, these are features that are in the tool for 20 plus years and they have not changed. And they still produce the damn ugly spreadsheets. You know what I mean? So there is no magic button. There is no magic button where you can say, I have this 5-step process here. I have a napkin sketch of it. Now I take a photo and I upload it. And now you tell me, dear BPM tool, what I have to improve. So that just simply doesn't exist, right?
Well, I think there are some approaches now that are like advanced features around AI, but we've already had a couple episodes on AI, and I've talked to some really, really smart, well-researched AI people. A process recommendation through AI right now is something that I'm very wary about.
Yeah,
because first and foremost, liability. Like if you get it wrong, the AI gets it wrong and you implement the bad solution, liability is unclear. And that's super scary. You always say the words one throat to choke about like ownership, but solution ownership, that cannot be a system. A system cannot make decisions, management decisions. Therefore, a system cannot be management. Isn't that an old quote, right?
Mm-hmm. I'm with you. I'm 100% with you.
Let's talk about features of a tool. What would you want to see with something you could actually take from traditional approaches to a more digital twin approach that actually helps to achieve meaningful analysis and, more importantly, a meaningful proposal for change?
So I've seen two things in the tools. One is creating that visibility. So having the ability to display metrics, right? Metrics that you get from runtime systems and put them in an overlay or whatever. Put them, one tool has a little extra, whatever, not sidebar. How do you call that? Bottom bar? Where you have another part of your window popping up, and then you see the different steps and you see the specified metrics for each step there.
Yeah, overlay, a pop-in overlay or something like that.
Kind of. But you can define your walkthroughs. There's two cases depicted in this process. One is, and I make that up, one is online and one is personally through a branch, if we're talking banks, to see, how do the metrics play out between the two? What's the most or the best of those, right? So I've seen that attempts to create that visibility and then bring it in and not just have a diagram that's just boxes and arrows. So that is one thing.
Well, if I can quickly interject on that one a little bit, because years ago, I actually worked on a project, not early in AI, but I guess with 2011, geez. Yeah. So earlier in AI and machine learning, where we did exactly that with metrics. One of the things you have to remember with metrics is you need to see a population segmentation in outcomes based off of data inputs. It's a more technical way of putting it, but essentially you need to see that conditions within your process that lead to separate outcomes are segmented enough that you can say this might be a root cause of a population moving in a certain direction. We called it in a butterfly. Essentially, if we found a certain combination of characteristics in how a process was being executed, that a population would tend to move and separate in a way that we could say, this set of characteristics meaningfully affects the outcome. And so you're not just saying, oh, I want to hire this or lower that, but here are a combination of things that lead to a set of outcomes that I like and a set of outcomes that I don't like. So you can identify which metrics actually matter to your business value that you're trying to inspire or to the waste you're trying to eliminate.
But I think this is an advanced thing. I see this type of stuff now implemented in mining tools. Right? When you think about variant analysis and all this. What I'm talking about is more like get that visibility in a diagram. Just see it, because back in the day, you had those KPIs maybe measured, but they were hidden in a sidebar or in an assigned model where you had to click through to get to. So nobody looked at it. So I think that
we're disconnected totally. So you would never even see them.
Yeah.
It's like, there's a BI dashboard over here, and somewhere else in the world there's a process model, and the two shall never meet. So you have no idea why you're doing if you changed anything meaningful.
Yeah. So the good news is I've seen vendors now going into that direction to say, okay, we need to display it in the diagram, which is great, right? The second thing that I see is mostly analysis around the effectiveness of the process. Right?
Sure.
So this has so many issues because this is just one of the 5 areas that we discussed in part 1. Remember? Process, technology, org, data, and risks. Right? What I see in the tools, because they are process tools, is just focusing on the process view, which I think is a shortcoming. Right? But when we look at this, and I remember back in 2014, I was working for one of the big home loan mortgage companies here, where we did a process analysis and we mapped it out and all that stuff. And then I said, okay, hey, with that tool, can we just run a damn report for some key things? And the answer was, no, we need to get the vendor in to create a custom report for you. And I said, oh, forget this. We just mapped out that process from ideation to process to project implementation. 5,000 steps. I don't have time for it. So I had 6 people, and we were going through our processes, and they counted it manually. We got a big spreadsheet, and then we figured out, oh, you have 53 handovers, right, which was completely invisible in that overall process. But speaking of that, let's go through a couple of examples of those metrics. And the first one I already mentioned, handovers. Right? How often do you have in your process a handover from role A to role B? Right? Every handover stops the process effectively because the case will be in somebody's inbox or the part is stored on a shelf or whatever it is. Right? So there's some waste, right, that you have. And you want to get rid of that waste, So now you can do that in actually 2 ways. You could say, oh, you redesign the process that there is no handover. If JM starts it, JM finishes it, right? Or you have a smart assignment of resources, be it machines or be it people, so that you optimize that wait time in between to ideally 0, right? But you need to understand in your process, well, I have so many steps, and in those steps, I have so many roles, and we have obviously so many handovers, and the time in between is X, and the aggregation of that time is Y, right? So now you have a target, and you can say, oh yeah, I need to bring that down. The second thing is, and it's in the same realm, if you will, is switching off tools.
Yeah.
Right? So lack of interfaces. Right. So when you go and say, I have this thing in SAP, and then I report it out into Excel, and then I change things in Excel, and then I upload it back into SAP, that doesn't sound great to me. Right. So
and a lot of people try and fix that problem with RPA rather than actually fixing the process problem underlying that, which is you're asking for tool to tool integration.
I worked in for a software vendor. And we were having a workflow tool, and we did exactly that nonsense. Salesforce, Excel, SAP, Excel, back in SAP. right? And at one point I had enough, and I was just asking the VP, and I said, shall we ask some friends at TIBCO if they can sell us a license so that we can automate it? It did not resonate well with some people. Yeah, but I had it,
yeah. And but by the way, you're talking about that as well. You also have the degree of automation in processes, which is a nice metric. How often are you doing a process that is a manual step versus a system step versus a user task that still requires human interaction? We see that a lot in check steps. So how often is a check step requiring actually a human interaction with it to sign off and like tick the box versus do we have business rules in place that automatically pass the vast majority of cases through without having to require human intervention? Or can we do sampling or things like that? You can see that as a process metric.
And when did you update that business rule the last time? Your approval for purchases over $50. Well, if that was created in the 1980s, then those $50 in 2024 money is a little bit more, right? You should update those as well. But just the other way I'm thinking about it, switching tools, there's always a mental break in between, right? Because the UI is different, you might have to look for, what was that in that other tool? Do I see the same number here? You have that. So it's exhausting, right? So you just have a waste by forcing people, bringing up that mental capacity, and then, what's also related to it is obviously the swivel chair interface, right? How many handovers do I have or steps do I have where I need to manually enter data? And JM, I know there's tons of reasons, but maybe you can enlighten our freshly minted BA about why having swivel chair interfaces is a bad idea.
Well, I think that the biggest part of it is actually there's two big parts. Well, big part number one is a lot of waste. You are paying you're paying a lot of money for knowledge workers to do very manual work that that's not a good use of their skills. So it's a financial waste. And the second thing is it's very risky. Remember that manual entry has a high chance of typos, missing fields, other types of issues that will later on cause problems for your process. And so data integration, auto population of fields, and as I mentioned in disparaging terms, it also is good. Things like RPA can help to reduce the amount that the swivel chair interface is costing you in terms of the process efficacy, because frankly, it can get in the way of your process executing correctly, and it can really frustrate your people, leading to burnout, leading to turnover, and ultimately leading to cost and risk of operations. Another source of that cost and risk of operations is when you have a lot of extra manual checks and approvals, so much oversight to a process. I understand you need governance. I know you want that. I know you want to make sure your process is running right. But if you over-govern a process, you are going to eventually pay the cost, not just in the fact that it's expensive, but that it's cumbersome, that it's frustrating, and it's less effective for your employees and less effective for your customers.
And there's also the way how you do this, not only in the sense of manual versus automated checks, but also is it a push or pull, right? So do you need to get in that example of that analysis project that I did? It was always a push. So, pull, right? I get it served on a silver platter, right? Yeah. I'm your checker, serve it to me on a silver platter, right? That is definitely not the way how it should go, right? And we tried to change this and said, no, let's build dashboards, and let's have alerts and let's have escalations and all that wonderful stuff. And again, I learned the hard lesson again. It's the damn people that are the hardest thing to change, so culture change, it failed. It failed in that, and I think these are things, dear aspiring business analysts, that you might want to have a look at, and maybe your tool of choice gives you some reports or some form of automated analysis or statistical analysis that can point you to these things.
Well, speaking of a statistical analysis, Roland, I want to move on to the next one because
Yeah.
a big piece of the puzzle here is when you take a look at expected flow versus real flow. And when we take a look at tools like process mining as a mechanism for uncovering issues in process, one of the big issues that I see, and I remember working I talk a lot about working in my time in a railway company, transportation company, that I spent a ton of time helping to improve their operations. And one of the big issues was degree of standardization. They had processes all over the place doing the same thing, working a different way. And when you have process mining and process modeling as mechanisms for BAs to uncover issues, you can see pretty clearly when there's a lot of variation and when there's also sort of like harmonized variation. Sounds like a weird way to say it, but like you have segmented ways of doing the same thing by business unit or by location. There are often some ways of doing it, but as we like to say on this podcast, like you're not that special. You can do procure to pay for the most part the same way across most of the company. And there are way fewer exceptions than you think. I think everyone thinks it's always has to be this exception process. If everything's an exception, then there is no process. We believe that there can be a process. So what's the degree of standardization? Because that can be a great lever for you to harmonize people's good ideas from across the organization into one standard approach. And that's actually it's a lot of mental load to sort of harmonize and a lot of political work to harmonize, but they're kind of all giving you the answer. They just say it differently, right?
I agree. But then there's a lot of things that the tools do not capture, or where you just put it in the tool and then people say, well, what do I do with it now? Why do you make me doing this effort? So there are some areas where you literally have to go in and then do some rationalization, and I will link to the article where I've written down all those different example metrics, because I don't want to burn all the time that we have in that podcast reading that article. But one example that you would see, for example, is your data rationalization, where a script just won't help. You would need to come up and try to standardize, in your words, to standardize the vocabulary in your organization. And I worked on another project where we had a team that was tasked with that. And after 2-3 months, they came, and I think I mentioned that example in the previous episode as well. They came back and said, hooray, we got our first agreement. We got a definition for the customer. And the definition was customer is somebody who wants to pay for the products and services that we provide. Mind blowing, But then people came back and said, no, I'm HR. My customers are my employees. No, your employees are your employees, your human resources, right? Or marketing came back and said, no. Well, kind of is your customers. But before you have a customer, you have somebody who's interested in this. This is not the person who's a customer, So you have to go in there and then say, okay, how do we create that vocabulary? And then once you have that, and we spoke about data modeling and all that stuff back in season 6, and I'm happily will link to it. But then you have to do the rationalization between your conceptual and logical and physical data model to try to take out the waste there, right? Because why do you store that information in 25 different systems that are not synchronized? Oh, and by the way, what does it cost to create that synchronization, right? Can we do this simpler, easier, with less complexity, right? So all of those examples and more are in that article, but I like to move us on. So that the first point in this second half is obviously the tool features, right? So what does my tool give me? But I like to bring it up a level, right? There are, as you mentioned a little bit earlier, approaches out there that are decades old, and maybe even longer, when I think about the Egyptians building the pyramids with shipping all those big rocks to whatever, right? Hard manual labor. There's a process underneath. I'm pretty sure somebody has rationalized how you do that the best way. But there's different methods in that. And I think, and we mentioned that in the podcast more than once, I think we're living in a time now where computing and storage and all that stuff is cheap, apparently. And
Apparently.
we see now, I think, a new quality, which is more data driven. Not that other methods didn't have that, but it was way more cumbersome.
Expensive.
So JM, talk to me a little bit about data driven approaches for process analysis and human focused approaches, and where you see the differences and where you might see an overlap.
Yeah, I think that data-driven, I always like to see the words evidence-based decision-making, which is asking and answering the question, what actually happened and why does this matter to us? The data can tell some of a story. We see that in process and task mining, oftentimes a way to uncover the actual execution and put good statistics around how it operated. The manual approaches of this are being able to take the data and contextualize it within the business value. We talked before about waste and business value, right? Well, what is having a process executing in 23 hours matter to the business? Well, you have to know that there's a 24-hour SLA that has penalties, and you can put a dollar value against that. In fact, I worked for a logistics company based down in the Southeast United States, and they had a literal cost they had to pay every time they broke the SLA. The dollar value that they were betting they were going to be able to get all the shipments completed from tip to tail within 24 hours. And so the business knowledge, the manual work was being able to say, what does this mean to us? And how do I hook that into a dashboard? So from a BI perspective, taking a statistic and doing calculations on it to turn it into a value measurement. That's the translation effort that is oftentimes manual. Task mining, on the other hand, is the manual part of task mining is contextualizing that in a business operation. So I say I click on place X, I type in value Y. What is this actually doing for me? So now I have to come in as a business expert and go in and define, well, that's when I entered the customer information. That's when I selected appropriate product. So it is a combination of tools and very technical tools and human domain knowledge, that expertise of contextualizing, that brings it to a level where you can actually see what happened, why it matters, and what you could do to maybe change it. But Roland, that third thing about changing, I think, is really important. And I want you to talk a little bit about how you can maybe see the future using the data as a driver.
Yeah, I think I'd like to untangle that ball of yarn a little bit, right? Because I also will put a graphic, a little Venn diagram into the show notes for those of you who are more than happy to steal this idea. But what we did in that Venn diagram is just putting the different techniques, methodologies that we've seen on that spectrum from data-driven to human-focused. As you rightfully said, so yes, they come together, but there's also the fringes. So, for example, you pick where I should start. Say data-driven, right? You have BI groups, right? BI groups are great. You know, their whole purpose is create visibility, right? One of the three things that you should look at, you know. But the challenge is, well, what do you look for? Right? So they might, and unfortunately that's the majority that I've seen, they might just capture some lagging indicators, you know, to say, okay, how many widgets have we created? And then based on that, they build those wonderful one size fits all dashboards, right? Which is also not helpful because that doesn't answer the question for the stakeholder. And JM, you might remember we had What's Your Baseline Short about how to build a good dashboard, right?
Oh, yeah.
Links in the show notes, right? Stakeholder orientation is the right thing, right? A flavor of that is then what you see being built into runtime tools. It's the execution monitoring, right? Which is great because you now have an automated feed because it's in the same tool and you have some reporting on it, which on the other hand, not great because it's just focused on that single runtime tool, right? I think this is where then, and the relatively newcomer, you know, it's over 25 years when the first commercial process mining tool came on the market, where process and task mining kick in, right? Because they look at the full process and all the systems that are involved, or all the interactions that a user does, right? With all those analysis techniques that we have been spoken about in many, many episodes, right? The challenge that I see with process mining tools, though, is they're process oriented. Not everything in an organization is a process problem, right? So they're falling short on that spectrum, right? And then, JM, maybe you take over the more human part of this Venn diagram now.
Yeah, I mean, we talked before about that human domain knowledge, but how do I extract that? Oftentimes through interviews, right? We talked a little bit about this discovery side, but it is a manual process. As I said in process and task mining, somebody had to know what that click does. And I think technical teams often get bogged down in the data without realizing that they need to go talk to the users and get them to give you an interview of what am I actually doing? Who am I working with? What was required for me to trigger this step that shows up on your screen? Remember that none of these data monitoring tools can capture the human activity outside of the context of the desktop. You need transactional tool data, you need human desktop data, and you need just activities that are occurring within your business from person to person. And that's harder to capture in those sorts of tools. So interviews play a big role in that. You also need to have a lens through which you filter this, or a methodological approach to analyzing this and understanding what you're seeing here, being able to put that into a structure that helps you to uncover the root causes and issues you can work with, and then seeing where your waste and value are created. And so oftentimes Lean and Six Sigma as methodologies come into play and give you a structured approach that lets you get into it. We had somebody from the Business Architecture Guild also talk about how the Business Architecture Guild is helping to define ways of structuring information so that at least you can start to have that kind of like rigorous approach to take all this data and contextualize it within the business. And that ultimately should lead you down a path where you have the information you need, you have the business context, you have a data structure, and you have a pathway to a future state or future states that you want to define. Now the question is, which one makes the most amount of sense? And Roland, we've talked a little bit about simulation kind of offline. Tell me why that is you find that a useful tool for helping you to make decisions.
Oh yeah, I think it's vastly underrated, right? Even though we already had an episode about simulation, but I think the big challenge that you see is with those process analysis tools. May it be the modern ones like process mining, may it be maybe a little bit more traditional way of doing statistical calculations or running reports or whatnot. What is the question that comes up after you've done your analysis? You figured out, oh, this is not great. So what's the question? The question is, well,
how can I make it better?
Yeah, how can I make this better? Some smart man says predictions are always hard, especially when the future is involved. Right, and I think the best thing that we have today is, and this is the whole digital twin spiel, is to have things running and have simulations of potential future outcomes, right? And before our AI overlords take over and do that automatically, well, as of time of this recording, the best thing that we have is simulation tools, right? And those simulation tools, and we spoke about that, typically run into two different flavors, Monte Carlo versus discrete event simulation. So one is calculating probabilities, while the other one is brute force, create instances and push it through each instance and note the timestamps and resource utilization and blah. Either way, they allow you to play, right?
Yeah.
You can go and in the process mining analysis episode, we spoke about that you should have an hypothesis. Where do you think? And that's obviously in our new nomenclature, that's the context information that you get from interviews, right? Because everything lives in a context. So you look at your hypothesis and you say, yep, and what a good process looks like. So you look at that and say, okay, I want to be have more capacity. Right, I want to spit out more widgets at the end of my conveyor belt, right? So now I see I have a bottleneck. The simulation shows me that, right? My process mining has shown me that, right? And you take the data from your mining activity into your simulation tool. So now you could think about, okay, what happens if I throw more bodies on it? Does that solve the problem? Maybe it does. Maybe it doesn't. Maybe it's whatever, a different problem. Machines take too long, but those damn machines are super expensive. So it's not realistic to buy a new, chassis stamping steel machine for a car manufacturer, right? Or maybe it takes too long to change the machines. If you have something new that needs to be stamped, whatever it is. So maybe that's not feasible, right? If it's feasible to say, okay, I just throw more bodies on it. Well, where do I get them from? Do I have to hire new ones, right? Which cost, which increase more risk, because if you haven't heard it, you heard it here first. Humans sometimes do stupid things, that might not be compliant. Or can I take resources from elsewhere? Because I see the utilization downstream in my process is low, right? So the first logical thing would be to say, okay, I'll just take a couple of guys and put them on tasks upstream, right? Simulation will tell you if that is a great idea. If you solve the bottleneck, or if you just created a bottleneck further downstream, because now you have too few people at the downstream process, right?
But if I can put one caveat here, Roland, though, I just want to make sure that all of our audience doesn't expect this to be magic. A lot of people talk about simulation like it is magic. One thing that I've seen with a lot of simulation is that it doesn't accurately predict the future, but it can be very useful in comparing potential future outcomes for a single scenario. So you put the same data in, you see a bunch of different possibilities. They have, relative to each other, different value and outcome. And then when you run them, it doesn't actually work the way that the simulation said exactly, but the solution is better because it was better than the other solutions under the same data set. So it's not a crystal ball, like but it is a cool tool.
It's like horseshoes and hand grenades, close enough. So
close enough. Cool. Think about closing, Roland.
Yeah, it's better. And also it's better than having nothing, because you have right, and that helps you. Shameless pitch. Another link to shorts that we did, how to create a business case, right? Because at the end of the day, you will have to tell people, oh, I recommend doing X, Y, and Z, and this will be the outcome. It will cost you $5, but you will win or gain $10. Right. And then the decision maker can make his or her little calculation and say, great, do it. And that's why I'm a big fan of simulation.
But as we said, it's not magic. And I think there's a combination of things we've talked about. We're going to leave you for a little bit of a break. I think all your process and analysis brains are burning here. And I want you to think about what sorts of tools you use today in order to capture the process, analyze the process, be able to come up with possible solutions, and then pitch those solutions as the value that they'll create or the waste they'll reduce for your organization. We'll leave you for a moment and come back with our final thoughts and conclusions for the episode.
And welcome back. Hey, JM, this is obviously the point in our shows where we ask the guests how to reach out to them, and they would tell us which wares they have to pitch, writing a book, having a whatever. Not today. And that was a very lively conversation, JM, wasn't it?
That it was. And if you want to keep the conversation going, you can. So thank you to our wonderful audience for joining us in this podcast, but join us again on LinkedIn. Have comments in our thread of conversation after the fact. So please come check out What's Your Baseline on LinkedIn. And as Roland's been mentioning, a lot of these things we're talking about are going to appear on the article that's going to accompany this particular podcast on whatsyourbaseline.com. So come join us, become part of our family, share it with your friends, and we will see you later, friends. But until then, I've been J.M. Erlinson.
And my name is Ronald Wold.
And we will see you in the next one.